Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scott McKay.
Greetings, gentlemen. Welcome again to yet another episode of the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. My name is Scott McKay, Real Scott McKay, on Instagram, at Scott McKay, on both Twitter and Clubhouse. Hope you'll join us on Clubhouse every Monday night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. That's GMT -4. You can find us on YouTube by searching Scott McKay. The website is mountaintoppodcast.com. And I invite you to join us on Facebook, all you good men of character out there, by joining the Mountaintop Summit Facebook group. I got an exciting show for you today because I love to delve into these topics that involve, some intelligence, some thought, some deep thinking above and beyond what we're used to. And I particularly love having highly intelligent guests on who know their stuff, and I know you guys too. Today will be just such a show, probably in spades. My guest today is a cat named Gleb Tsipursky. He hails from Columbus, Ohio, and the name of his gig is Disaster Avoidance Experts. What we're going to talk about today is how blind spots in our brain keep us from effective decision making, from getting the women we want in our life, from processing things mentally effectively enough to make the things happen that we want to have happen in our life, including getting that right woman in our life. So it's going to be a fantastic discussion that could go in any number of directions, and I know you guys love that too. So without anything further, I'd like to welcome my guest today, Gleb Tsipursky. Welcome, man.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, man. You know what? I first found your work because, strangely enough, or I guess this is normally enough, frankly, I found your books on Amazon, and I love the titles of them. They're about blind spots and not trusting your gut and really flying in the face of all this colloquial advice we've been given by our grandma and our grandpa and our moms and dads and well-meaning people who really haven't studied much all of our lives. And I guess to begin here, you have a wonderful story about growing up. And I know your first 10 years were spent in the country that is now Moldova. And you came over to the United States when you were 10. And you have an interesting story about how your mom and dad and their parental style had forever influenced your thinking on this particular subject. So go ahead and tell us about that.
Happy to, Scott. So what happened was that my parents, just like pretty much everybody's parents, told me to go with my gut, follow my heart, trust your intuitions. I mean, you hear that all the time. People like Tony Robbins telling you to be primal, be savage, do what you feel your gut is telling you to do. And Malcolm Gladwell telling you to blink, make your decisions in the blink of an eye. So no wonder my parents were telling me that. And they told me that, and then they were making their own decisions like that, especially my dad. And my mom, for example, was someone who enjoyed shopping, and my dad was kind of a cheapskate. And so when she went out and, she'd go out and she'd buy, $100 sweater, and she'd come home and she'd tell my dad that, whatever about the sweater. And then he would start yelling at her that no sweater should be worth over $20. And then they go at it. She'd bring up past hurts. He'd bring up past hurts. And you know what? This pattern continued, so many times, so many sweaters, so many little things. Clearly, my parents were making this bad mistakes in their decision making about their relationship. That was only one example. With my dad, the worst example was with my dad. So my dad was a real estate agent, and he had a pretty good year, 1 year, and he made quite a lot of money. But he told my mom he made very little money. She couldn't check up on him because it's all based in commissions. And so he hid this money and he bought an apartment. He bought an apartment, which is, a lot of money. Then he hid that from my mom, and he was making some rental income from it until she eventually found out. And you know what? That was pretty devastating for the relationship when she found out. She felt betrayed. She felt that he really took advantage of her lack of knowledge, and it was a huge, major scandal. She kicked him out of the house. They eventually reconciled, but she could never trust him again. So, that really showed me that the style of my parents' decision-making, of going with their gut, of following what their gut was telling them to do, was not good, was not healthy for relationships. And that's a very important thing that, and I was making mistakes when I was younger because I was following my parents' advice, as, many children will do. And seeing my parents make these mistakes and seeing myself make mistakes because I followed my parents' advice showed me that, I probably don't want to follow my parents' advice in relationships or other life areas based on my gut. And that's when I decided to study decision making and risk management and future proofing. How do you figure out how to have the best future for yourself and relationships and other areas, making good decisions and managing risks? That's not something anybody teaches us. And that is a big, big problem. It's stuff that should be taught in school. It's stuff that should be taught, in college, but it's not. And I was shocked that I wasn't taught this stuff in school, high school, college. I wasn't taught this stuff. And that's when I decided to learn about it myself. And I became a professor. So I got a PhD in the history of behavioral science, looking at decision-making cognitive biases, which are these mental blind spots that cause us to make bad judgment errors. And that's how I came to write those books, especially relevant for relationships, is the blind spots between us, how to overcome unconscious cognitive bias and build better relationships.
You know what? It's really interesting because you're absolutely right. You can throw this idea of proper decision-making, effective decision-making on the mountain of topics that should be taught in school and aren't. And, as you were talking, I couldn't help but imagine how many of us out there can relate to a home life in early childhood where someone was making bad decisions and the other person was simply along for the ride. And as you were telling your story about your old man buying the apartment and not telling your mother, the realization occurred to me that, if you're making decisions and you're going out of your way not to tell anybody about them, you almost don't want anybody to even know you made those decisions. It's like, come on, man, you already know that's a bad decision if you're ashamed of it. You know what I mean? And yet, here we are. And anytime you're not trusting your spouse, your significant other, you're going to fail miserably at making that woman feel safe and comfortable in your presence. And around here, Gleb, that's one of the pillars of being attractive to women and building long-term relationships. And I think when people make bad decisions, not only do they live, a life that's not their best life. I mean, they're going to have the fallout from all that bad decision making, but they're going to have a hard time getting others to trust them, getting others to come along for the ride. They're going to be poor leaders. I mean, bad decision makers by definition can't be good leaders, can they?
Absolutely not. And that's a big, big problem in relationships in the workplace. So I do a lot of consulting on that, but of course in your private life, personal life as well. So this is a fundamental issue. Why don't we share about our decisions? Why do we try to make those decisions alone? There's extensive research that the more important a decision, whether it's in work, whether it's in personal life and relationships, the more we tend to trust our gut, not less. The less we tend to go with data, the less we tend to consult other people, the less we tend to try to get external information, and the more we turn inward. And that has to do with how our brains are wired. Why do we make these bad decisions? So unfortunately, what the recent research on this topic has shown is that our intuitions, our gut reactions are actually not wired for the modern environment. They're wired for the savannah environment. When we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, tribalism was fundamentally important for us in that period of time. That means looking for people like us and supporting them, supporting their values, and opposing people who are not like us, who are different from us, so kind of discriminating against other folks. And we can talk about that. That's one set of problems. Another set of problems is called the fight or flight response. We had to make instant snap judgments, and we had to rely on our gut for survival in that situation. In our modern environment, there's many less threats to our survival. It's also called the saber-toothed tiger response, when we had to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. It was fine to jump at a shadow and not worry about the shadow. But right now, that's causing us a lot of stress, and it's causing us to make quick judgments, and it's causing us to not consult others in making these quick snap judgments about really important topics. And then once we don't consult somebody else, it feels bad to come back to them and say, I made this decision without you, and therefore, I didn't care about your opinion. We feel shame, we feel guilt, we feel these negative emotions, and men are not taught to be aware of their emotions, which is a fundamental problem that we're not taught to be aware of and respect our emotions and deal with them. We're just motivated and we move in certain directions because of our emotions often without realizing it. So this is a big problem. And this is something that real men need to address thoroughly within themselves to have any hope of having true, healthy, happy, lifelong relationships.
Well, I think it's very interesting that you would bring up that our primal instincts with regard to decision making are really pre-wired for simpler times, caveman days, where most of the decisions we had to make were more akin to a shortstop knowing whether to dive left or dive right when the balls hit at him. Nowadays, our decision making has a lot more strategic ramification for a life well lived and the people around us and all the complexities of post-modernity compared to just simple tactical decision making of, okay, do I shoot or do I not shoot, or do I move closer to this woolly mammoth before I stab it in the heart or not? And, and it's interesting how people really do rely on the lesser evolved primal instincts rather than taking the information we now have available to us through the gift of human technology and modern thinking and the ability to tap into the minds of lots of great thinkers. And we just really just crumple it up and throw it in the trash can. One of my favorite authors, of course, is my namesake, Harvey McKay. I just love how he writes and how he talks. And one of his most famous quotes is, if you make decisions with your heart, you get heart disease. And that kind of harks back to exactly what you were talking about earlier. Yet we as men do it all the time. We do it in the dark. We try to do it in secret. We buy a new Corvette when, practically speaking, we knew we needed a pickup truck. We go date a woman we know is crazy and unfaithful and will ruin our lives, but she's got really nice boobies, so we're sticking with that plan. I mean, guys do these things all the time. And, you know, that's why this topic, oh boy, not only is it timely for so many guys, but it's all important if we want to be men who live our life fully with wisdom. And wisdom really is a life well lived, right? I mean, at the baseline here, Gleb, you're teaching us how to be wiser men.
Absolutely right. And this is something that we really need to understand. We need to understand and appreciate our emotions if we are to be wise men, because our emotions are something that drives us in whether we recognize them or not. And if we don't recognize what's driving us, how are we ever going to make wise decisions that are beneficial for our life goals in relationships and in all other areas?
And indeed, Gleb, the name of your new book, your newest book, I should say, has the very curious phrase, blind spots in it. And, you know, we were chit-chatting before we hit record on this show, and you were very quick to point out that blind spot really is synonymous for cognitive bias. And I added the phrase seeing the forest for the trees in there, which a lot of guys really have a hard time doing. I mean, men and women both. A lot of us have a hard time doing that. And I think that is a feature of maturity and indeed wisdom. And you have so many different ways to break down that topic in your book. And all of them are so cleverly branded. I mean, you're almost like the pickup artist of wisdom. You have acronyms and little catchphrases for everything. I mean that in the best way possible. You thanked me, but I mean, that could have been taken either way, but it's something I think a lot of these guys listening will be able to relate to. And you have all these cool ways of talking about processes and mental lapses and ways to be mentally tougher. And I would love to dive into those and give these guys really practical ways that they can stop being blind in their own decision making and, you know, open up their minds, see that forest for the trees, and live a better life. And, you know, as you say, this is for better decisions, which leads to better relationships and indeed that wise life well lived. Now, you talk about decision making in terms of future proofing. Discuss that a little bit.
Sure, happy to. So thank you very much. And first of all, about the blind spots and recognizing that, because too few people realize and appreciate that blind spots exist and they really harm us. And that's actually one of the cognitive biases, one of the blind spots called the bias blind spot. So the bias blind spot. If somebody believes that they're not biased, they are very much falling into the bias blind spot, because everyone suffers from these cognitive biases just because of our evolutionary background. As I mentioned, we're not wired for the modern environment. We're cavemen in our gut intuitions. That is why we need to really learn about these blind spots and how to protect our future. That's why I call what I do future proofing. protecting our future, protecting ourselves, from the damaging, harmful parts, mental patterns in our mind that cause us to make very bad decisions in our relationships. So in order to have a great future for yourself, to future-proof your life, your relationships, your workplace, you need to make sure that you're making the best decisions. That is at the root of everything that we do as human beings. Make decisions. We make decisions about the smallest things in our lives, whether, who we send a text message to, who we go out with, who we like or don't like, how we relate to other people, on social media, on Facebook, on all of these sorts of things, how we relate to others, and huge decisions like who do we take to be our lifelong partner? And, who do we go with on a long vacation? Big decisions. So we need to realize that all of these decisions are fraught with potential blind spots. If we don't recognize what our own blind spots are, and I'm happy to share about mine, but we need to recognize which ones we are most prone to. We need to study ourselves. We need to recognize ourselves. We need to recognize when we're being emotionally motivated to make bad decisions. And we need to learn to withdraw, step back from those bad decisions, take a pause, and evaluate the situation in a calm manner that doesn't harm our relationships, which it will if we just let ourselves have that fight or flight reflex, that saber-toothed tiger reflex, and make a snap judgment that really harms our relationship.
Well, bad decision-making leads to bad outcomes. Good decision-making leads to good outcomes. And what kind of needs to go along with that is a realization on our part, Gleb, that we have control over more than we may think we do. I mean, the victim mentality is, oh, I'm not in control of anything. Everybody's in control of me. Whereas someone may have a megalomania to the point where they think they control things they really don't have control over. Like if I just pray for the weather will change and, stuff like that. I mean, you could argue that's praying for a deity to be in control, but I think in a very real way, people often ascribe personal control to things they really aren't going to be able to control. The will of others, a certain outcome that they really can't control. Like, for example, I'll have people call me and they want me to do some coaching with them. And they're like, let's make this other person be attracted to me. I'm like, no, I can help you. You and I have control over who we are and what we do. And I can certainly offer ways for you to be a lot more attractive to a lot more women. But it's kind of like insurance. I know exactly how many Boss 302 Mustangs are going to get wrecked this year. Okay. So I can charge you the proper amount to insure your car. I just can't tell you which Boss 302 Mustangs are going to get wrecked this year, right? And it's kind of like that with women. I can help you be attractive to more women, but I can't guarantee a certain woman is going to be attracted to you because she's, her own agent. She makes her own decisions. Mm-hmm. And yet a lot of people really have a hard time wrapping their head around what is it that I have control over and what is it I don't have control over. And, so when we say to ourselves, all right, well, here's what I can control, here's what I can't control, and we make well thought out decisions with regard to the pros and cons of every decision we're going to potentially make, we make those decisions. And if it's a well-informed decision, we generally do well. And this is really troublesome for people who have a personality type where they're feelers more than thinkers, isn't it? Because we all know deep down that if we go to, I don't know, let's find a really cheesy example, a timeshare seminar where they offered us a free, lazy boy recliner for hearing their pitch. Everybody goes into that room thinking, okay, I'm going to get my lazy boy recliner and I'm going to leave this place and I'm not going to give them any of my money. But if the person giving the pitch for the damn timeshare is emotionally appealing enough and has read enough books on how to manipulate people and make them feel good about a decision, and people are in this euphoric state in the moment, then they'll all throw money at this. And we've seen people get on stage and have entire rooms of people rush the stage and throw money at something. And there's buyer's remorse on the part of almost all those people the very next day because they made that emotional decision because someone knew how to pluck those heartstrings and make that emotional decision happen. What do you know about how that process works? And what should we know about how that process works?
So there are several things that we want to address here. One is about control and one is about emotions. Let's talk about emotions first, because we already talked about emotions a little bit. So in emotions, there's a concept called the empathy gap. The empathy gap, that's a cognitive bias, a mental blind spot, which refers to us greatly underestimating the impact of our emotions on our future selves. That's one. And the impact of other people's emotions on them. So how other people are motivated by their emotions and how our future self is going to be motivated by his emotions. So we have to think and separate, and this is hard to do. We have to separate ourselves in this moment right now from our future self. We tend to think that whatever we tell our future self to do, the future self we do. We kind of have 100% alignment with our future self. And that's completely not the case. And you can realize that when you're going for trying to avoid eating that, third donut and not succeeding in avoiding eating that third donut, that's when you can realize that whether you right now make a decision to not eat more than 2 donuts, your future self will be triggered by sugar.
Gleb, I'm at the point in my life right now, man, where I better not eat that first or second donut.
Fair enough.
But yeah, thank you for the crystal clear example. Perfect.
Yep. Thank you. Maybe, the second donut, right? So that is something that we're triggered by sugar, and sugar triggering comes from our evolutionary background, that caveman background, because in that environment, we had to be triggered by sugar. The ones who survived and thrived and reproduced were the ones who had as much sugar as possible when they came across a source of sugar. So right now we're triggered by sugar, and we don't realize, we don't think, and we don't recognize that our future self will be triggered by sugar. That's kind of one type of triggering. The second type of triggering here with the seminar is triggered by greed, by resources. Of course, in the savannah environment, it was important for us to get as much resources as possible. Here, we give up our money, which is a very important resource, for a nearly useless resource like timeshare. That's a bad decision, but that's triggering for resource, for greed. And we're triggered by lust. This is a big problem where we are triggered in the savannah environment. Those who are triggered by lust often were able to survive, thrive, and reproduce. In the modern environment, that's a very different context. But there are so many people right now who are triggered by lust and who, like you said yourself, who marry those women for the boobies and don't think about the long-term consequences to their relationship. Yes. That is a big, big problem.
Such dirty little tricks our cavemen selves play on us.
Exactly.
Our lizard brain is the enemy here, man. I'm telling you.
It absolutely is the enemy. And we have to recognize it and we have to retrain it. Because if we just let ourselves make the same mistakes like my parents made the same mistakes, that is a big problem. And so many people make mistakes in our lives, with marrying the women with the boobies, right? So that's the empathy gap, where we underestimate the impact of emotions, of those gut intuitions on our future self. And we have to recognize that. And we have to recognize that we will not be nearly as restrained in future situations as we tend to feel. We think of ourselves as logical, rational creatures, and we're not nearly as logical and rational as we would like to believe. And we have not nearly as much restraint as we would like to believe. Our exaggeration of our own restraint is a cognitive bias called restraint bias, where we exaggerate our ability to restrain ourselves. When we go to a bar and we get drunk and, restrain ourselves from hitting on women in a way that's not very helpful for our relationship, or choosing the women that would have the nice boobies but don't have a good potential for our relationship. So we need to recognize that we are less restrained than we would like to believe. We are more motivated by emotions than we like to believe. And therefore, we can address that by putting ourselves in situations where we won't be nearly as triggered, and retraining our minds to grow mentally, to have what I talk about in the book as mental fitness. Number of techniques for growing mental fitness. But if we don't realize these blind spots, we will put ourselves in situations that will cause us to make bad decisions and have a really negative relationship and other life outcomes throughout our lives.
That's a fascinating concept, that we tend to put ourselves in situations where we know we're going to get in trouble because it's something we want to do or something that we're just drawn to for some reason. And at the end of that experience, when we're there and we've drank 5 Long Island iced teas, we just don't want to hand the keys over to someone, even though they're demanding it of us, because we're thinking, I'm okay, I'll drive home. And that's exactly how this process works. We overestimate our ability to restrain ourselves. Like, you know what? I'll go and I'll just have a beer or two and I'll go home. And then they're plastered 2 hours later. Or, I'll end up with a really good woman who will treat me right. And, they get duped again by someone who scams them or someone who just looked good on the surface. Man, it's just strange, not only how we get ourselves into these positions so habitually as humans, but how, we kind of live to fight another day anyway, and we just keep doing the same thing over and over again. Right?
You're absolutely right. And that's the thing. We don't learn from our mistakes because they feel right.
Emotion, right? It's heart disease all over again.
Exactly. It's very hard for us to recognize that we're making these mistakes because they feel right internally. And here's one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult aspects of making good decisions. Differentiating our internal feeling of something being right. We feel right. We feel comfortable with it. We feel it's the correct thing to do, from it being the actual right thing to do, from it being the actual correct thing for us, for our goals, for us to do this. It's very hard, which is why we keep making the same mistakes. We keep feeling that the wrong course of action is the right course of action. And we trust our feelings in the moment over the more rational part of us, because we feel, well, we wouldn't feel this way if it wasn't the right thing to do. I wouldn't feel these things for her if it wasn't the right feelings. I feel love or lust or whatever you feel, and that feels right. And it feels like, you're not going to restrain yourself from whether drinking more beer or going after this woman, even if your friends are all telling you that you're making the same mistake, dude, that you made 3 times before. Why are you doing this? Having the 4th wedding to the same type of person that screwed you over the previous 3 times. But you're like, no, this is different.
Same relationship, different person.
Yeah, everyone is telling you that this is the same person. And so here's what's happening. Trusting our feelings, our gut reactions, our intuitions, when they're telling us to do what's actually wrong for us. And this is at the crux of people making horribly bad decisions in their relationships and other life areas.
Yeah. I tell you what, you have an entire book devoted to the concept of gut feelings, one of your first books. So this is an incredibly central and important issue to your life's work, I know. Let's dig into a few more of these really cleverly branded biases and concepts that you talk about. What is the pessimism bias? And specifically, Gleb, how does it pertain to women in dating and relationships?
So there is the pair of biases, and I told you that I'll talk about some of my own cognitive biases, and this relates to them. The pessimism bias and the optimism bias. The pessimism bias and the optimism bias. What's that about? Well, it's kind of like it sounds. The optimism bias, these are people who are optimistic about the world. They feel that the glass is half full. They see the grass as green on the other side of the hill. They see the world as a nice, full, rich place full of opportunities. And that's me. So I tend to be quite optimistic about the world. But unfortunately, people like me are risk blind, and that's a problem in itself. So we'll talk about that. Pessimism bias is the opposite. It's people who see the world as full of threats, full of challenges, full of risks, and they tend to be risk averse as a result. And my wife is actually a pessimist. So this creates one set of tensions in relationships where I kind of, have 20 ideas before breakfast and I feel they're all brilliant. And she doesn't feel they're all brilliant. And we have a lot of conflicts and arguments before I started learning about the optimism bias and the pessimism bias in graduate school and started applying this to my relationship. So when you and your life partner or someone with whom you're in a casual relationship or anything in that range have opposite pessimism and optimism bias, you will tend to have a lot of conflicts. The optimism person will be perceived by the pessimistic person as shooting from the hip and, kind of going on off half-cocked, whereas the optimistic person will perceive the pessimistic person as being all Mrs. No or Mr. No. So that's on one set of tensions. Another set of tensions is generally for men who are pessimistic. They tend to see their chances with women as being much worse than they are. They feel threatened by women. They see the world as full of threats, and they feel especially strongly the threat of rejection, the threat of problematic situations with the women, maybe accusations of sexual harassment or something like that, they feel a lot of threats. So they tend to not take as many risks with women as they should. They tend to not form as many relationships as they should. And within a relationship, they tend to see too many problems, too many tensions, and tend to leave it too early when perhaps they should have stuck to it and it would have worked out very well for themselves. So that's two sets of issues that relate to the optimism and pessimism bias.
So how closely are optimism and pessimism biases tied to self-confidence and self-esteem?
Oh, it's very important for self-confidence and self-esteem. People who are optimistic tend to have much, much more self-confidence and self-esteem than people who are pessimistic. And of course, women tend to be attracted to people who have more self-confidence and more self-esteem, not the ones who shade over into arrogance, but there is extensive research in behavioral science on self-confidence and self-esteem being associated with attraction. So if you tend to be on the pessimistic side, it behooves you to learn how to present yourself as more confident and more optimistic and having that stronger sense of essentially what's tied to masculinity than you tend to feel internally. And that, again, is something that differentiates our gut feelings from how we behave and what kind of decisions we make. If you are pessimistic, you want to take more risks in relationships and you want to appear more confident in your interactions with women than you tend to internally feel you should.
So acknowledging the presence, or the possibility, I should say, of either of these biases, how does one find a healthy balance?
One needs to learn about oneself. So I mentioned I tend to be very optimistic. Like I said, having 20 ideas before breakfast and feeling they're all brilliant. I used to have surprises for the person who would become my wife, do surprising things for her. And she really didn't like surprises because they were bad from her perception. They were potentially risky and threatening. I really like surprises because I'm optimistic. I see them as full of hope and opportunity. So I had to learn for myself that that's a bad thing. And it's completely not intuitive for me that it's a bad thing. So you have to learn about the other person and yourself, where you are. Now that I learned about the optimism bias and the pessimism bias during graduate school, brought that into our relationship, we are much better as a team. So, for example, with those 20 ideas I have before breakfast and I feel they're all brilliant, I kind of hand them off to her and say, here are 20 ideas. What do you think can be done? And she's like, well, these are all half-baked potatoes, but maybe these three are worth finishing baking. And then she is great. People who have the pessimism bias are great at improving ideas. They're not great at generating ideas because they see the inherent flaws of each one. But when they see an idea, they can judge it, evaluate it, and improve it and implement it. They're great at that. So she takes those 3 ideas that are, worthwhile, and then she goes and she implements them. So this applies to everything. We work together. We're in a business together. She does that. Recently, for example, we're planning a vacation. So going on vacation, I always do the research for the vacation and I generate a ton of things for us to potentially do. And then she's the one who filters them out. She says, no to this one, but maybe these couple of things. And then we go to do these couple of things. So that you have to learn about yourself and you have to learn what your strength is, either if you're optimistic or pessimistic, and collaborate well with the other people who tend to have the opposite personality. So that's one thing when you're with people who have opposite personalities. When you're just by yourself, you have to learn about, again, whether you tend to be optimistic or pessimistic. And this is pretty easy. Most people can identify where they are on that scale. And then you have to calibrate. So you have to calibrate. I tend to be very optimistic. That means that when I'm not interacting with people who are pessimistic, I need to scale down my optimism. I need to bring that down. And I say, okay, because I'm optimistic, I tend to be risk blind. So I tend to not see as many problems, as many risks, as many threats and situations as I should. Therefore, I need to exaggerate the threats that I perceive in the situation, look for threats that I wouldn't otherwise, because my intuition, my gut reaction is to ignore threats, minimize them, perceive them as minor, non-existent. So I have to really look at those threats and really think about their consequences hard, give more weight to threats than I would otherwise. If I was pessimistic, people who are pessimistic should do the opposite. They should look for the rewards, the opportunities of a situation, and weigh them harder and more importantly than they intuitively feel they're worth. So that is how you would calibrate for yourself and change your behavior, at least, if not your internal feelings.
Fantastic. I love the examples you gave because, first of all, there's something there for guys who aren't in a relationship yet, in planning maybe who they're going to be in relationship with someday. And for guys who already are in relationships, you've outlined the crucial importance of being a team and really complementing each other as a couple. Fantastic. Talk to me about something that I perceive as being similar to this optimism versus pessimism bias that you call overconfidence bias. We related that to confidence and self-esteem. As you were discussing with me before we hit record on this particular episode, the overconfidence bias is not unlike a Dunning-Kruger effect. So go ahead and explain that to us.
Sure. So the overconfidence bias is related to what's known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's our tendency to be way too confident in our judgments. And it definitely is relevant for both optimists and pessimists. Optimists tend to be way too confident about their positive judgments of what's going on. That the situation is good, everything's fine, there's a lot of opportunities, everything's great in the relationship. And then the relationship goes south and they don't realize that the relationship is going south because they're only looking for information that shows them that everything is good. And so they tend to be overconfident about things going well. Pessimists tend to be overconfident about things going badly. They think, oh, nothing's going right. Things are not going to go well in this relationship. Or, oh, this girl will never go out with me. I shouldn't even try. And they look for all the bad things and it's kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So kind of cycle of doom. So you want to be very aware of where you are in the optimism scale and the pessimism scale and how that correlates to the overconfidence bias. And overconfidence bias in general causes us to be overconfident about our judgments. And that relates back to those snap judgments we made in the savannah environment, that fight or flight response. It was very beneficial for us to make a judgment very quickly to survive in a certain situation. Our ancestors who didn't jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger, they didn't
survive.
Very
short lives. Yes.
Exactly. So now we make very snap judgments. We're wired to make snap judgments. And overconfidence bias causes us to make these snap judgments because we're overly confident based on a very limited amount of data of what we should do. And that's a big, big problem. So the overconfidence bias, for example, we see that there's been studies done on people who, when they're asked, when you're 100% confident that something is right, how often are they actually right? They're only right 80% of the time. So think about that. When you're 100% confident that your life partner, the person you choose as your life partner, is going to be there in a year, you might be only 80% right. So
here's a quote that I'm going to go ahead and drop on the table here. And I don't know if I'm the first person to ever notice this, but hopefully I am, and so be it. Almost every time someone has ever told me they're 99% sure about something, the 1% has reared its ugly head 99% of those times.
Yeah. So it definitely tends to happen more often than you think. So this is a big problem. And this is something we need to be really aware of, that when we feel strongly confident about something, we may be exaggerating. We're very likely exaggerating when our actual likelihood of this being true. So this is the overconfidence bias, and this is what you need to be aware of and wary of in order to make good decisions.
Yeah, the whole idea of I'm 99% sure kind of rhymes with trust me in conversational context. You know what I mean? I love it. The Dunning-Kruger effect, I think, is more about shining the light of truth on the relationship between ignorance and arrogance. Like the less I know about something, the more I'm sure I know a whole lot about it. And then someday someone sits you down and goes, okay, well, here's all the nuance and complexity of what you're trying to think you know a lot about. And the person goes, oh. So that's what it was really all about. You see this in political circles all the time. Everybody is an armchair senator or congressman or president. They think they know everything about everything. And really, we probably know almost nothing about what's really going on. All right. You have something that is very curiously called halo and horns. Talk to me about that.
So the halo and horns has to do with how we perceive other people and tribalism. I mentioned that in the tribal environment.
Speaking of politics.
Yes. In this tribal environment of the ancient savannah, it was very important for us to affiliate with people who look like us, who had our value sets. If we didn't, we'd be kicked out of our tribe and then we'd die. And if we weren't sufficiently hostile to other people who don't have our value sets and our predispositions, our tribe would be taken over by a hostile tribe and we die. And we notice we're the descendants of those who didn't die. So right now, the halo effect is our predisposition to judge those who have something we value, some characteristic that is similar to us, as better than they actually are. And the horns effect is our tendency to value other people who have a characteristic opposite from us as being worse than they are. This is very dangerous for relationships because, you might value somebody way too much because they root for the same team that you do. Sports ball, right? This is a big issue and people are sports fans and they root for the same team. But just because you root for the same team and you have a lot of emotional passion for the same team doesn't mean it will get the rest of your relationship in tip-top shape for everything else. So this is an issue. Now, of course, if they root for the opposite team, here I am in Columbus, Ohio, and we're the home of the Ohio State Buckeyes. So people here are very big Buckeyes fans. But if somebody's a Michigan fan, which is a big rivals up north, it doesn't mean that they will be a bad relationship partner for you. They can be very good in other ways, despite being very mistaken about which team to root for. So this is something we need to understand, that we in our relationships tend to look for signs of tribalism. And those signs of tribalism may not be at all indicative of who is a good person for us to have a relationship with. In fact, with the optimism and pessimism bias, if you can figure out how to work together, you will tend to do better with somebody who has the opposite bias, because somebody who has qualities, characteristics that complement your strength and address your weaknesses. So somebody, people say you find strength in diversity. And this is about that. In a relationship, you can find strength in diversity, but the halo effect and the horns effect militate against that. And that's something we need to be aware of and address.
Well, the halo effect is, of course, widely talked about, but you're the first person in my entire life I've ever heard discuss, what you're calling the horns effect, the opposite dynamic. What immediately came to mind when you started talking about sports and how, Yankees fans think all Dodgers fans are awful and vice versa, is what happened when LeBron James jilted the Cleveland Cavaliers, his hometown NBA team, basically, and went and formed the Heatles, the infamous Miami Heat team of the early, 2010, 2014 era, with a couple other superstars, and talked about winning not 5, not 6, not 7 championships. And all of a sudden, everybody in Cleveland couldn't stand the guy. He was villainized. I mean, it's kind of like how the band The Pretenders had a song called There's a Thin Line Between Love and Hate. Emotion that is extremely strong, that is extremely powerful, love or esteem, when that person wrongs you or cheats on you or humiliates you or, does you wrong in any way, really, all of a sudden that same level of powerful emotion, all of a sudden the pendulum swings on that same powerful level of emotion and you hate that person just as much as you loved them 10 minutes ago. And that's what happened with LeBron James. All of a sudden, the hero of the city is persona non grata at best and, public enemy number one at worst. And the most curious part about that, of course, as everybody knows, because this is now in the past, it's ancient history, LeBron James went on to return to the Cleveland Cavaliers and bring them a championship. So, now what? This guy left us. He won championships in another city, which should have been our championships. But now that he's not with them anymore, he came back. So all the people are trying to unburn all of their LeBron James jerseys. And then he brings them a championship. It's like, oh, okay, it's all good. It's just absolutely unbelievable how people's hearts and minds turn based on that emotion. Now he's with the Lakers, and the Lakers didn't go to a championship, and, great timing for having having the reboot of Space Jam come up with LeBron's face everywhere, right? But that's exactly how that works. And I think it's fascinating that you would shine a light on that because, man, what a tangled web we weave in this life by just making these broad brushstroke assumptions. And indeed, nowadays, in the climate we have socially and how the media has driven it, you can't straddle the fence in terms of thinking for yourself and having some mindsets that align with this particular echo chamber of people and some that align with other, because basically you'll get villainized by both sides. It's just insane. Anyway, moving on here because time is short. You have something called the illusion of transparency. What's that?
So illusion of transparency has to do with how we communicate. You and I are communicating right now. We're feeling that the podcast show listeners are getting 100% of our message. And when guys are communicating with women, they feel that the women are getting 100% of their message, that they're hearing, receiving, and accepting 100% of what they're saying. That is not the case.
Well, my optimism bias is hoping it's true nonetheless.
There you go. But the illusion of transparency is about that not being the case. When you study how much information people actually receive from you, it's way less than 100%. Some things they mishear, they misunderstand, they mishear, so kind of technical errors, especially over digital communication, but in-person communication as well. And there's things that they misperceive. So, for example, if we have a difference between what we're saying and our body language and our tone, they may be confused and frustrated by some of that and really not get what we're saying. So especially if they're not really good at reading body language and tone, or if the body language and tone they're used to and that you're used to is different because you come from different cultures, different people in different areas have different body language and tonality for various expressions. And of course, they're also looking at the content and perceiving the content of what you're saying through their own filter. And their filter causes them to certainly not accept some of what you're saying and twist it in other ways that become sometimes barely recognizable as your words and your meaning. And also, in addition to that, sometimes people look at you and nod their heads as though they're agreeing with you and accepting what you're saying, when internally they're completely disagreeing with you and not at all accepting what you're saying, but they just don't want to get into a conflictual situation. This especially tends to be the case with women who are talking to men. And then men are surprised when women don't call them back or, because they don't realize that the woman has not been accepting what the man is saying and then feels upset that the man has not recognized that she wasn't accepting what he was saying. So this is something that you really need to address and figure out within yourself, the illusion of transparency. There are various techniques to address that, which I talk about in my book, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. But if you don't realize that this is happening in the first place, you're never going to successfully address it.
Two things come to mind. First of all, it is absolutely a social pandemic, okay, that people will assume everybody agrees with them, likes them, and is on board with them. When in reality, most people think they're an idiot. They just either don't have the moxie to or don't even have the energy to stand up to them because it's just not that important to them. You see that all the time. Like someone is being a jerk or someone has a bad idea, but because that person has a strong enough personality or people fear backlash from that person or social humiliation or embarrassment from that person if they call them names, or there's this perception that a person has a whole lot of clout or maybe more clout than they actually do. So the masses may disagree with this person, but they let them go and do their thing, even though really they're the only one who wanted it that way. I see that all the time. And, that's something that's taught in books about power and influence is how to get people to comply with you. You get the people who really have nothing to lose by agreeing with you to agree with you by buttering them up and making them feel good and giving them all kinds of emotional warm fuzzies. And anybody who disagrees with you, you shut them up by somehow crafting this threat that if they open their mouth, they'll be very sorry they did, That's the first thing that comes to mind. And that's something that I'm sure you talk about and that I'm glad we discussed here on this program, because I don't think a lot of guys have really opened their eyes to how that dynamic works. And it's easily learned by reading certain books, Cialdini books, Robert Greene books. The guys who've read those books know what I'm talking about. The other thing that comes to mind is a lot more simplistic. I really think it's human nature, Gleb, for people to think other people care about their stuff more than they do. Like, for example, I run this podcast, and this podcast is very important to me. So it would be potentially easy for me to believe that all of my listeners just hang on pins and needles for midnight every Thursday night Central Time for this podcast to come out because they live and breathe this podcast. When in reality, they don't. It's a part of their life. I'm certainly glad and appreciative and grateful that it is, but nobody listening to this podcast cares about my podcast as much as I do. And socially speaking, there's no one worse than someone who starts conversations with someone else, assuming the person's going to care as much about them and their stuff as they do, because that's how you get people you're in conversation with to start, looking around for an escape route and hoping to be rescued. But yeah, I think that's all part of what you're talking about in terms of this illusion of transparency, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And this is definitely the other thing you said is about caring more about your own things. It's called the egoism bias, where we greatly exaggerate our own self-importance compared to other people. Yes. And so this is definitely a problem for us. I talk about that in the book. In a relationship, both people tend to exaggerate the benefits that they bring to the relationship. So if you think about, let's say, house chores, and you ask both members of a relationship, here's 100 points. How many points of house chores do you do compared to your partner? I can guarantee to you, I have done this, and not most people, the sum will add up to more than 150.
It's like the study I've read where something like 75% of people think they have above average intelligence, which is, of course, statistically impossible. Yeah.
Exactly right. So that's a big problem called the egoism bias, where we exaggerate the benefits that we bring to the relationship, any specific area of the relationship, and the relationship as a whole.
Fantastic. And the last one we're going to discuss here has my favorite title, my favorite name of all of them. FAE would be the acronym for fundamental attribution error.
That's right. So we tend to attribute other people's actions to their personality as opposed to the broader context. And we tend to attribute our actions to the context as opposed to our personality. And especially from a negative perspective. So, for example, if you go out with someone and they don't call you back and you try to get in touch with them and they kind of ghost you, you think of them as bad people, a bad person, kind of a jerk, something like that. But if you go out with someone and the date completely didn't work and the person was just really bad, and then they try to get in touch with you and they keep calling you and they keep texting you, and you are just think, what a jerk they are. Why do they do that? Wasn't it obvious that the date didn't go well and that I don't have an interest in seeing you again? And so you can place yourself on either side of that, and you will tend to think of the other person as the jerk, not yourself as the jerk, not realizing that the other person is doing exactly the same thing. So you're fundamentally misattributing what's actually going on. You're attributing the other person's behavior to their personality as opposed to the context, which you might not realize is how the date has gone badly, or you might not realize that the other person thinks the date has gone badly. And that's something that you really need to address if you want to have good relationships with people.
Man, that's just integral to the very kernel of human nature. Just yesterday, I was at a four-way stop sign, and it was my turn to go, but this guy in an SUV decided to go right as I was going to start going. And I just kind of picked up my hands and waved him like, whatever. Okay. And he stopped like, a car and a half length into the intersection and just kind of waved me like, oh, by all means, Your Majesty, go ahead of me. And I just kind of waved back to him. All these gestures are through our respective windshields. Like, oh, hell no. You started this. You finish it. And as the guy goes through, of course, he flashes me both middle fingers, hands off the steering wheel, screw you, buddy. And I just thought to myself, well, of course he did that. He was the one who was trying to bogart my turn into the four-way stop, but somehow I'm the idiot and I'm the jerk for challenging it or for, wanting to clear up this confusion. It happens all the time. if you get on Twitter, you'll see a bunch of people doing this. Oh my God, the other side does nothing but insult people. Those stupid idiots. That's every tweet for the past year and a half or past 5 years. Oh man, it's so true, isn't it? Gleb, I love everything you've said today. You have such a great sense of humor about you when talking about human nature, and yet you put it in such perfectly understandable, well thought out terms. I want to send these guys to your book. And indeed, we're going to put all of your books on my Amazon influencer page right at the top of the queue. And guys, you can reach that by going to mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon, and you'll find all of Gleb's books, including the one on gut feelings and how to navigate those. But his newest book is indeed called The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, by Gleb Tsipursky, PhD. And when you go to www.mountaintoppodcast.com/Gleb, Gleb, you will be transported directly to his website where you can find out all about his book and get a copy of it for yourself. And if you'd rather just go to Amazon and grab it, you could do that by going to mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon. Gleb, great conversation. I love shows like this. They're among my favorites. Thank you so much for joining us today and gracing us with your very intelligent and very intuitive thoughts on this very important subject. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Scott. It was a really great conversation.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun for sure, on top of all else. Gentlemen, I invite you to go to mountaintoppodcast.com and check out our sponsors, which include Hero Soap Company and Origin in Maine. Hey, the guys over at Origin have added a couple new flavors, not only of their excellent energy drink, which has no carbs in it, by the way, but also of the best protein powder you're ever going to find anywhere. Also, if you haven't ordered a pair of Origin's boots, these are about the most manly footwear you can imagine. They have the Lincoln boots, and now they have them in a ox blood color, which is really, really sharp. You can check those out by going to mountaintoppodcast.com/Origin or clicking on the link at the main site that takes you to Origin. Also, the guys at Hero Soap will clean you up, make you smell and feel better than ever before. I can tell you firsthand, women love how clean you are and how good you smell, which is probably the most important part of all the mix. Well, I don't know. I would add on to that also that there are no fake ingredients, no phthalates, no parabens in this soap. It's all natural, which means it isn't going to feminize you. Your testosterone receptors are safe with Hero Soap Company. You can go to mountaintoppodcast.com/Hero Soap to check them out, or once again, click on the link that takes you there from mountaintoppodcast.com. Guys, the year 2021 is over half done. Can you believe how quickly this year is going by compared to how slowly 2020 seemed to go with COVID and everything? Let's get the right woman in your life. No more cognitive biases. Let's get you a clear perception of who you are and the kind of woman you want in your life. You can talk to me free for 25 minutes by clicking the red button in the upper right-hand corner at mountaintoppodcast.com. You can also download a free report. A free book on how to get past your sticking points is there for you. And you can sign up for my free newsletter, which gives you daily information on how to be a better man and get better women in your life. It's all there for you, as always, at mountaintoppodcast.com. And until I talk to you again real soon, this is Scott McKay from X&Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X&Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the free X&Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.